be in 1 Samuel chapter 20, and continuing through about 2/3 of the way through 1 Samuel, and then we'll get into 2 Samuel and keep going as long as we can with this. It's been a while since we've been in 1 Samuel. We've kind of been there, but been there through some of the Psalms of David, and without knowing the Psalms, it's really hard to know David. And where we had left off was chapter 19, where Saul is pursuing David, and David, in multiple ways, has been protected. And now David is going to be protected again through his friendship with Jonathan. And Jonathan's going to really choose David and choose to honor David and help David over his father and his father's kingdom, which is significant. But I wanted us to look a little bit this morning and think a little bit about one narrative text, the idea that so much of the Bible is told to us, and it is historical, but it is told to us in a story format, and what that means. But also look through some of the background biblically to what's come before 1 Samuel, and how we get to this point to where why do you need a David? Why do you need a king? Why are David and Saul contrasted? And then where that's headed a little bit with 2 Samuel. And so it's just important to recognize, as I said, that so much of the Bible is in narrative events told to us, like the Gospels that are, we have 4 of them. Why don't we just have one that's just the life of Jesus, or just these aspects of what Jesus did or said? Why do we have 4 Gospels? And why do we have Genesis and Exodus, which is half narrative and half law and other things mixed in there? And so much of the Old Testament lays out the Bible in a historical narrative, but it is a story, and it is told in a certain way. And it's important to realize that we need to interpret narratives correctly, because it takes up so much of biblical literature, and understanding also that the narrative is not the pure event itself. It is a reporting accurately of the event, but it comes from a certain point of view or a certain angle. Just like the Gospels are all true and they're all accurate, but Luke and Matthew are very different than John in what they have so much overlap, but they tell a very different point of view on who Jesus is. And we need all 4 of them. We need all 4 Gospels. And this passage and these things in 1 and 2 Samuel, they lay out for us, the events in David's life, but the order in which they lay them and the things that they emphasize, and putting Saul in there and showing certain things about Saul kind of tell us important theological things as well. It sets up things and it tells the story in a certain way so that we can see how God is working. And so the way that the story is told matters, and we need to see that there's complexity there, and there's complication there. Just like a movie is complicated, that if you can film a scene from which angle, but the angle that you see something happen in, that matters, or it can emphasize something, or it can make a point. And that's what 1 and 2 Samuel are trying to do. They're trying to tell the story of David, but there's other things that happened in David's life which may not be reported here. Or why do they lay out these events in this order? Or why do they show David sinning or doing these different things that happen in his life? Why are these events explained in this way? And it's kind of like how any good story is told. We have to get the main point of what the author is trying to get at. For example, take like Jesus with the parables. Often in Sunday schools when we tell these stories or something like that, or Jesus with the parables, we get out the flannel graph and have kind of, okay, this is, we've got Jesus feeding the 5,000 and this, and then we try to draw some moral point from it, like, okay, well, the little kid gave up his fish and his bread and that was nice and you should be nice and we should be nice, but that's not the point. That's not the point of why that's in the Gospels or why they emphasize that miracle. It's not about, being nice or sharing food or something like that, or Jesus with the prodigal son. The whole point there, one of the greatest sermons probably on that is John MacArthur does a great way of laying out that sermon. It's all about what Jesus' point there is all about shame. It's all about the shame that the son brings on the father, the shame the son brings on himself, the shame that the second son brings. It's all about shame, and the father's reacting in a way mercifully to both of his sons that's seen in a shocking way to the Pharisees. So we have to kind of get the point of what they're getting at here. And I kind of compare the way that these stories are told. It's kind of like if you read or you've seen, something like a Sherlock Holmes story, that you pick up these details going throughout the story, and you kind of are putting together some idea of what's happening, but then it kind of gets tied together at the end, and you see, okay, now I see why these earlier details matter, because they kind of solve the mystery. So it's important not to just say, okay, well, here's a Bible story, here's David and Goliath, you in the story and I in the story are David, and we need to go out and be brave as we fight our Goliaths or our trials, when that's not really the point of why that story's there. The point of those things is to portray David in a certain way and Goliath in a certain way, as they're representatives of two sides, and they're representing their people, and they're the champions of their people, and that God ultimately is going to use his king to destroy the champion of the other side. So there's different theological things that are represented there that I think we kind of get missed if we just kind of got the Veggie Tales or the Sunday school flannel graph, which can be fine for introducing us to those things. But if we never go back to these narrative stories, what we often get from them is, okay, well, there's just kind of a moral point, but not really seeing God working through history and seeing the point that God's moving things toward, and how he's really building his kingdom, and then really seeing the epic and the drama that God uses to bring forth his king, and even with David, to bring forth his king, and then his king fails, which is a built-in failure. He chooses David, and David can't do it. Even David isn't able to accomplish what is required to totally bring in the kingdom, and sets up that need for Christ and that need for him to be the true king. And so we have to be aware of those things, and just as kind of an apologetic side note, just something for us to be aware of as we study these things. There's, over the last few years in Western Christianity, they've kind of determined that just through different studies and things and talking to a lot of Christians, especially younger people, and by the way, this is the time where you have most young people, 18 to 35, identifying as none as far as their religious belief. No religious affiliation, and that gap is increasing, and they're usually moving from Christianity. This doesn't mean they were Christians, but they were moving from Christianity into the no religious affiliation category in the ages of 18 to 35. And even a lot of people who are still within the Christian camp, who still would associate themselves with Christian morals and Christian teachings and would say that they believe in Jesus. It's been kind of determined by people who did a study on this and talked to a lot of Christian young people that the real religion is not true Christianity defined by Christian doctrines, meaning the deity of Christ and the Trinity and biblical inerrancy and things like that. But it's been called moralistic therapeutic deism, meaning it's moralistic. They know that you shouldn't have sex before marriage. You should, not cheat on your taxes. That you should, in general, be a nice person. That you get that kind of from church. That you're moralistic. That you follow kind of a moral code, and that there's a risk of doing that even with biblical narratives. That it's just a moralistic point. You just kind of take whatever you will from it in order to be a better person. And then therapeutic. That you go to church or something in order just to feel better, that God's kind of your therapist, and you get some sort of mental health from that feeling of praying. It doesn't matter who you're praying to or what you're praying for, but being with people and being part of community, it's therapeutic. And then deism, which is that God has created the world, but is not specifically involved in the world or in history or involved personally in people's lives, so that he's there available for the moralistic and therapeutic part, but is removed from the specifics. And so this is the religion, if you will, that's kind of growing, that's not Christianity, but is growing and is a threat to Christianity if you have people in churches who really don't know the gospel, who really don't believe the gospel, who really don't believe the Bible. And that's just an important point, I think, as we study narratives and restudy narratives and go back into them and see what's really going on in this text. What's it really driving toward? And so I wanted us to look at a little bit before we get into this, but since it's been a while, how did we get to this point in 1 Samuel? Biblically, theologically, why is there so much focus on this character David and him becoming king? Why is the idea of a monarchy and a theocracy, why does that matter in the Bible? And why, what's come before that's kind of set up for that? So I want to look through just a couple verses and a couple different books to kind of reset the background of this book needs to be here because it fills an important hole in biblical literature. That if we didn't have 1 Samuel, a lot of the Bible wouldn't make sense. You're missing something very key that sets up for the rest of the Bible. And so we should start at the beginning. The first book of the Bible. Now we usually. Let me say this with a caveat. The first book of the Bible, obviously, is Genesis. But earlier than that, the first written book of the Bible is most likely Job. Job is alive. He's a Gentile, righteous Gentile believer alive during the time of Abraham, is what's usually believed about that. There's some thought as to one of Abraham's relatives who kind of has a Hebrew name is mentioned in Job, and it's thought possibly he could be the author of Job. We don't know. Some people think Moses might be the author of Job, which could fit as well. But Job introduces, the story of Job, and most of us, when we look at Job, we look at the beginning of what happened to him and the end when God speaks to him. But there's so much in there in those conversations that he had with his friends. And what Job really sets up for, and what Job is really wanting, is he's setting up for the need for a mediator. He recognizes he's a sinner, and he has a need for a mediator. Okay, and this will set up for 1 Samuel, and we'll see how. But he needs someone to go between him and God. And he needs someone who can empathize and sympathize with him, and someone who can represent him before God. And so he needs kind of both. And so he needs a mediator for three reasons. One is that he needs a mediator to forgive sin. He says to God at the end of Job 7, I wish that there was some way that you could forgive sin, that you could let my sin go, that you could make me right before you. And he knows in some way that he's a believer before God, and God can do anything he wants to him, but he also knows that he's right before God, but he doesn't know how. And he goes, I wish that there was some way for my sin to be taken care of. And so he wishes for a mediator to fill that role. And then in Job 9, which we talked a little bit about last week as we were looking at one of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 4 we looked at last week, he says, how can a man be right before God? How can a man be just before God? In Job 9:1. And then he says at the end, at 9:33, I wish there was an umpire between us, meaning between him and between God, who could lay his hand on both of us. He's saying, no man can approach God. And he's saying, but God cannot come to me. He goes, I wish there was someone in between who could lay his hand on both of us. And to lay your hand on God, you have to be God. To lay your hand on man refers to him being man. So he wants a mediator to be divine and human, to somehow be able to bring that together. And then he also needs a mediator who can overcome death. Job recognizes that in this sinful world that he's headed towards death, and he recognizes that death is a sign of the judgment of God, and he needs a mediator that can overcome death. And he says this in a hopeful way, but he says in that famous passage, which we have hymns about and things, in Job 19, that he goes, I know that my Redeemer lives. So he knows that God is going to be his Redeemer. He knows that God lives, and he knows that God is the living God. And he says, in my flesh I shall see God. And so he recognizes that God is going to somehow take care of that. And that's what he's wanting and wishing for, but he doesn't have any way of knowing that that's true. He can kind of work those things out in his mind, but it's speculative. It's theoretical. Meaning, I know this is who God is, and somehow God's going to work it out. I just don't know how. And so what Job needs is, he would need the book of Romans or something like that to explain, to lay out for him that this is actually what God is doing.
Well, it amazes me that Job knows these things. I mean, I don't know where he gets this knowledge.
Right.
Somehow he has an understanding of God, a need to make sacrifices, a need to be righteous, a need to look forward to his redemption. That's pretty amazing, really.
Yeah, it is. Very early on, Job kind of being the first written book. And Job is, there's not really a Hebrew and Jew and Gentile hard distinction at this point. Remember, he's existing at the time of Abraham, where you're starting to kind of get that table of nations. But he's a Gentile who knows God, who is a righteous man, and him and his friends, his friends are not helpful, but they're not stupid. They are discussing deep philosophical, theological truths and working their way kind of. I mean, if you read through Job, we still use these same categories to talk about different issues that have been questions that mankind has been asking and still asks to this day. If you go to a philosophy 101 class, a lot of these things are still going to come up. Why do bad things happen to good people? If God's all powerful, how can he? And all good, why would suffering happen in the world? Just different things like that. The questions that come up that are intensified for Job because of his suffering, and his friends. They're working out these things that are true, but they're missing something very key, and that comes in Job 28. And he talks about this whole question of where's wisdom to be found. And I've talked about this with youth group before. I've used this example. If I went outside and dug in the ground, I might have a chance of finding gold. it would probably be unlikely, but if I dig, I know that gold's out there somewhere, and gold exists, and I could go out there and probably find it if I, dug long enough. But who knows? I may find it, I may not. But if I was digging in the ground, I would not find wisdom. I wouldn't be able to look for it in the ocean. I wouldn't be able to look for it in the mountains. And this is what Job is saying. He's like, where's wisdom to be found? You can't look for it in the mine. The eagle's eye can't see it because you can't find it. You can't find it in the earth. It's not in this sphere. And then he says a very key thing, which Proverbs is going to pick up on in Job 28:28, is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And Job sets up the need for the rest of the Bible, because Job, it sets up the need for revelation. Job is saying, I need God to reveal these things to me, and God to speak these things to me, and to kind of reveal who He is, and in a saving way, in a way that's true and accurate, and in a way that He can reveal His wisdom, and not just speculate about what we wish. And what Job is wishing for is accurate. There is fulfillment of those things. So Job is the beginning of the Bible, because Job kind of shows us why we need the Bible. That's a very key part of what Job does. So Job wishes for these things. And then we move on to Genesis. And Genesis, is the beginning, the introduction, obviously, to the Pentateuch that sets up for why the world is the way that the world is. God, and how God created it, and what the perfection was that was there, and how sin entered the picture. And Genesis enters and talks about the provision of a mediator king as well, to replace Adam. Because Adam and Eve, you got Genesis 1:27 and 28, you got that God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female He created them. And then the next verse is 28, and He blessed them and told them to multiply, and told them to have dominion, to take dominion. So man is supposed to act as a king regent. He is meant to rule over the fish, the birds, the animals. He's meant to rule over this realm as the image of God, to represent the image of God, and he's what's called, as I mentioned, a king regent. He's not God. He's not the capital K-I-N-G king, but he is meant to show God in the world and to rule as God and to represent God in that. But then you see Genesis 3, so you have man, woman, and this isn't talking about worth of man, it's talking about structure of how God set these things up. But you've got Eve taken from man, and then the animals and all these things. But you've got man, woman, the animals, and the creation. And then in Genesis 3, it begins with, and the serpent, you've got animal, goes to the woman, deceives her, and then the woman tells the man to do something, and he does it. He eats the fruit, and he goes into sin. The world is turned upside down. And man has now forfeited by trying to be God. This is what Eve is looking at, that they're trying to have a wisdom and a goodness that is only defined by themselves, which only God can do. They're trying to take the throne of God. By that rebellion and eating the fruit, they forfeit the kingdom, and they give the kingdom over, in a sense, to Satan, to the serpent. And so God is ultimately still king. And in God doing this, He curses, not man and woman. They will experience the consequences of the curses. If He cursed man and woman, then we'd be doomed. There would be no hope. We'd all be in hell. He curses the creation, and He curses the serpent, and He curses man's labor, and He curses woman's childbirth, and He curses the things that they were supposed to use as their dominion and their rule to set up the kingdom of God on earth and to rule. And they kick them out of Eden. And Eden's not just the one place on earth that's the cool garden and has all these trees and stuff. Eden is the capital. It's sort of the throne room. It's sort of the palace. And Adam and Eve are removed from that. But God promises, Genesis 3:15, a mediator. Now, he's not talking about a mediator yet in the sense of what Job's asking for, but he's saying there needs to be another seed. Another Adam who can undo what Adam did. And another Adam who can break the curse and to take back the kingdom and to be a representative mediator of all mankind. So Adam, you get the idea that he's the representative of mankind. That's one of the reasons why we're sinners. It's in our nature from Adam, and he represented us. And Christ is also that representative mediator king who's going to and has restored the kingdom. So you've got curse, and then the opposite of curse mentioned later on, and how this king is going to come about. With Abraham in Genesis 12, this is the first time since things have been good, and then sin came into the world and there's curse. This is the first time that blessing is mentioned. So you see that is starting to be where the king is going to come from, and the restoration is going to come from. And Abraham's told, kings will come forth from you. And then toward the end of Genesis, you get a focus on two very important individuals. One of them is Joseph, who rules as a king, and another one who's actually given pretty much equal time and focus, but isn't always paid attention to, is Judah. And Judah is going to be, and it's not always good attention. He's doing, he's not always doing good things. He's not like Joseph in that way. But Judah gets the focus because Judah is going to be that one through whom the kingdom comes. And Judah is changed, and different things happen to Judah. And then at the end of Genesis, you have Genesis 49, where Jacob's speaking to him. He's saying the scepter, the object of rule for the king, speaking to Judah, will not depart from your house, from between your feet, until Shiloh comes, which is the one who brings peace comes, the ultimate king. So that there's this expectation for a king to come and rule and restore all of the goodness of creation and the perfection of pre-fall creation, which hasn't happened yet. And so we know who it is, and we know it's going to happen, it just hasn't happened yet. Exodus kind of pulls together some of those ideas between Job and Genesis, where you have God as the king versus Pharaoh as the king. And God says to Israel, I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests. And meaning that it's through Israel that the nations will have that priesthood through Israel to God. Kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and he gives them uniquely the law, which when kings would take over in their time, in the ancient Near East, when a king would take over, he'd read the covenant and say, here's the rules and the relationship between, using some bad grammar here, but this is more accurate to reflect it, between me and you, here is the relationship. And then the king would set out his law, and you'd have a Ten Commandments and the law all given uniquely to Israel. And then the rest of Exodus is really focused on the tabernacle, which is the presence of God on his throne, which is what the ark is supposed to represent, is the throne of God. And it also brings in that key idea from Job, because what happens, what's done in the tabernacle? What happens in the tabernacle? Worship. Another key aspect. So the tabernacle is built to look like the Garden of Eden. It has different things that look like, refer to the Garden of Eden, but also it has, if you read Leviticus, if you read Exodus, sacrifice and atonement happens there. And so now you get this idea of what Job is asking for. There's a way to that points to forgiveness of sins and dealing with those things. And so this only comes through God's kingdom. And then we studied Deuteronomy, which talks about the law of the kings. Kings are not meant to gather gold. They're not to pursue relationships with other nations through marriage and have many wives. And they're not meant to multiply horses and have try to have a military state by hoping in different technology of their time, the horses, and try to, and so when we see those, it's important to know Deuteronomy, when we see those from David, from Solomon, from Saul, David, he has a wife, he starts to add another wife. It's the thing with Bathsheba, he adds her on as a wife. David ends up having multiple wives. We start to see that there's a problem. And then you get Solomon. He has, 600 wives, 300 concubines, or maybe 700 wives. Well, yeah, so I know it evened out to 1,000. And then he also has these. He also gets into the gold trade, and then he also gets into raising horses for military purposes. So he's got all three strikes, and you start to see the kingdom's going to go into exile. That even the best kings, David and Solomon, who get the closest to restoring all the blessings of creation, the system's going to break because the kings have not followed the law of the kings. And then the kings are going to get worse and worse and worse until God says, that's it, taking them all off, but we're not going to have another king until we go all the way back to the beginning and start over with another David. And that's why Jesus is born in Bethlehem, by the way, instead of Israel like all the other kings, saying we've wiped the slate clean and we're starting back at the beginning. But anyway, then you go through Judges, which is there's everybody does what's right in their own eyes, and then this key part, because there's no king to establish the law. And then in the midst of the time of Judges, you get Ruth, which shows who the line of the king, who the king is going to be, and shows that line to David. And what's interesting with Ruth is Genesis has key parts of genealogy, which, when we're reading, we're kind of like, okay, well, this is kind of the boring stuff in the Bible. But the genealogies are very important. Ruth picks up where Genesis left off, and shows that David is the true king. And then Matthew's going to do the same thing thousands of years later. He's going to pick up and start with a genealogy and say, okay, here's your true king, and walk through that history again with a genealogy. And so that beginning to Matthew is very important for that gospel to the Jews, because they wouldn't have taken it seriously without a genealogy. And then you would get to where we are in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the true king, his covenant, and even his failure. Why does it matter that David fails? And 1 Samuel is really the preparation for the king and the kingdom. It's kind of like when you're cooking and you gather together all the ingredients and you see what all the, or you see kind of who all the players are. My sister and I went to a play that was at my other job. I work for Gorman on the side, and they were doing a school play, and before watching the play, I was reading through the little playbill, and it had the characters on it, who they were, and a little thing about them. And so reading that helped me understand, okay, when these people come in, who are they? And that's kind of why are they important? And so 1 Samuel sets up that you need you need to have the right priest, and that's why it starts with Samuel. And this is why you need the king to be anointed, and you need to have the king fulfill these different things. And so this is what 1 Samuel kind of sets up for when it all kind of gets tied together in 2 Samuel, where all the ingredients are kind of, you start putting them together and actually start the process of cooking those things. And so,
Josh,
yes.
Question. Why do you think Saul was king first and then David rather than David first?
Oh, okay. That's key to understand. Why not just go for the right man the first time? We know David is meant to be king, and that's part of why 1 and 2 Samuel is written, to prove that David's the right king. But if we remember back to 1 Samuel 8, the people ask for a king, and in just asking for a king is not the problem, but they asked for a king in order to be like the other nations that are around them. And God sometimes disciplines us by giving us what we ask for. And so he does that, and he tells them, look, your king is going to he's going to tax you at a rate, that shows that he thinks he's equal to or above God. He's going to enslave you, meaning you're going to have to work to pay for these things, and that are just going to his empire. He's going to create a military state where your sons and daughters are going to be forced to serve. You're going to have all this stuff that's going to take away from the freedom that you have under God and God's law. And, is that really what you want? Yeah, bring it on. And really, Saul's brought as and this is why I mentioned at the beginning, it's important to recognize the literature aspect of what we're looking at. Saul's what's called a literary foil, meaning it's a setup of a contrast between everything that Saul does. He's more representative of someone from Judges and what's going on in Judges, and there's so many comparisons between him and parallels between him and what the Judges do, and then comparing him to David. And one of the things that it's pointed out about Saul is, first thing about him is his qualification for being the people's king is that he's tall. I mean, that's all that's mentioned about him. But we also see that with David. Even though David's the right king, if you look at 1 Samuel 16, when David's anointed, it mentions, he is a man after God's own heart, but it also mentions that he's handsome. And so it's kind of like a way of showing that, yeah, even though this is the right guy, there's this kind of negative spot in it, showing that even David is going to have these problems, have these failures in him. And 1st and 2nd Samuel is unique to ancient Near Eastern literature, because if you talked about your great men in ancient Near Eastern literature, you don't talk about their failures, or you ignore them. That's why there's not a lot of Egyptian literature written on the time of the Exodus, is because you just skip those inconvenient areas of history. But this talks about David. It talks about how he is an imperfect man, and it does so on purpose, because the point is here not that David is great, but the point is that God is establishing his kingdom, and it is driving his kingdom forward. And David's going to set up that key pattern for what a true king needs to do. And ironically, on purpose, when it mentions Jesus in the New Testament, we don't know what Jesus looks like. It doesn't mean he was ugly or something, but in Isaiah 53 talks about just, his no stately form or appearance, because it doesn't matter. It's because his qualifications are based on what a king actually should be. So even more so than David, who's a man after God's own heart, Christ, his height and different things aren't mentioned. And so that's important as well. So yeah, thank you for asking that question. But so we've seen in 18, David's been exalted by Jonathan, by the people, by Saul, by his wife, and even by the Philistines. And then 19 and 20, we've seen that David is, protected because Jonathan advocates for him. He's protected. He gets away from Saul throwing a spear at him. And a second time, he's protected by his wife, lying to her father about him. He's protected by Samuel and the prophets, and the Holy Spirit comes onto Saul and doesn't allow him to attack David, and he brings him very low. Now he's protected by Jonathan's friendship. And so we see here that Jonathan also comes in to really protect David, and chooses David, even though choosing David would mean that Jonathan would never be king. Now we already know Jonathan's never going to be king. From a worldly standpoint, Jonathan is the crown prince, but he's trusting in God and attaching himself to the kingdom of David rather than the kingdom of Saul. And so let's read 1 Samuel 21 through 3. I'll just make a few comments on this as we go. But he says, "Then David fled from Naioth to Ramah, and came and said to Jonathan, 'What have I done? What is my iniquity?' And what is my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life? He said to him, Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. Yet David vowed again, Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and he has said, Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. I'll stop there for just a minute, and we'll pick up in just a second with verse 4. But Jonathan apparently didn't know Saul's most recent attempts to kill David. Remember, he'd thrown a spear at David once, and now he'd thrown a spear at him again. Now he's pursuing David wherever he goes, and David is coming and talking to Jonathan. He's saying, Your father's trying to kill me. And Jonathan's saying, he's saying, What have I done? Why is your father trying to kill me? And Jonathan says, Why? I don't know. He's trying to kill you. He wouldn't. If he was trying to kill you, surely he would have told me. And so David says, No. Your father has hidden this from you because he knows that you care about me, and he knows that you will protect me. But truly, I'm one step away from death. Death is close on my heels, following behind me. And so, he tells Jonathan of this, and Jonathan's put in this position now. And remember that Jonathan's not just a character, he's a real person, that he's having to choose a position of loyalty to his friend or to his own father. And let's read on in verses 4 through 11. So then Jonathan said to David, Whatever you say, I will do for you. So he's chosen David's side already. But he says, So David said to Jonathan, Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down and eat with the king. But let me go that I might hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. If he says it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself. For why then should you bring me to your father? Jonathan said, Far be it from you, for if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it? Then David said to Jonathan, Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan said to David, Come, let us go out into the field. So both of them went out into the field. So David asked Jonathan, Test out your father. See if he's angry with me. Tell him, when I don't show up to the new moon festival, when I'm supposed to dine there with the king, when I don't show up and you tell him that I've gone home, see if he's angry. And if he's angry, you know that he's decided on evil, because he has missed an opportunity to kill me. If he says, it's good, I don't care, David went home, not a big deal, then you know that I'll be safe. And so he gives, he tells him, test out your father, see where he's at, see for yourself. And so this would prove to Jonathan what Saul's motives were. And David is so confident in his innocence. He says, What have I done? What iniquity is there in me? He goes, Look, if you know of something that I have done against the king deserving of death, then you can put me to death yourself. You can be the one to cut me down if I have sinned against the king in a way that's deserving of death. And Jonathan's saying, What are you talking about? He says, But okay, well then your father's trying to kill me. And it's for a reason I don't deserve. And so he sends Jonathan to do this, and Jonathan makes that covenant with him. And what Jonathan does is really significant. Jonathan, again, renews that covenant with David and says, I'll test out my father, we'll sound out and see where he is. And if he wants to do you harm, I'll make it known to you. If he wants to do you good, I'll make it known to you. But either way, I will protect you. We'll figure out what's going on. But then he recognizes that David is going to be the king eventually. And he knows that the kingdom's ultimately been taken from his father. And so he sets up this covenant with David. In verse 14, or skip around a little bit, he says, "If I am still alive," this means basically when David's on the throne, "if I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die?" Now think about during this time, and really with most kingdoms, once one family line has been dethroned and another family line takes over, it's usually bad news for the family line that's been dethroned, not just for the individual king. But Jonathan is saying, remember me when you take the throne. Remember my family, remember my seed, remember this covenant you've made, and don't, remember that we were loyal to you, and, please don't treat us like we're all Saul, like we were all loyal to Saul. And so which of course David grants, even though Jonathan will not live until David is on the throne. He will die shortly before David is on the throne. But listen to verse 15. "You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord require it from the hands of David's enemies." And so they vow to each other because of their love and their friendship for each other. But there's a very key phrase in there. Now Jonathan says there, "my house," but he also says the house of David. And this is a common way of sometimes referring, you hear sometimes the house of Jesse, it just means the family. But in royal terminology, the house can refer to the most important person in it. And that's royal language. If you talk about, like the British, you could talk about the House of Stuart or the House of Tudor, which are these they're kind of the last names. They're the houses of who's ruling. And now Jonathan's recognizing that the house of David is taking over, that the house of David is going to be the one who's on the throne. And so they go through this plan. I just want to finish up with this last key point of kind of Saul's reaction here. Once Saul figures out that Jonathan is on David's side, the first night David doesn't show up, and he goes, okay, well maybe he's unclean ritually to participate in the sacrifice. Okay, maybe he's sick. Jonathan's feeding him these different things. He doesn't believe Jonathan, but he keeps asking Jonathan, where's David? He knows David's hiding from him. He knows he hasn't gone home. And Jonathan keeps telling him that he's gone home to Bethlehem. And so Saul's like, okay, he's here, but he just hasn't shown up. Then he recognizes that Jonathan is siding against him. And listen to what he says. 1 Samuel 20, 13 through 15. He says, let me skip down a little bit. This is in verses 30 through 34. This is Saul angry against Jonathan. It says, and then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan. He said, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness? Now listen to here, the verse 31. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established." So he insults Jonathan. He's not insulting Jonathan's mother. He's insulting Jonathan. And he's saying, you're bringing shame on yourself and the whole family. And he goes, don't you know that while David's alive, there's no chance for you to be king and have a kingdom? And Jonathan has already forfeited the kingdom, which is significant because Jonathan's already the crown prince. He's the next in line for the throne, but he's already recognized that David's the man, that David's the one who's going to take the throne. And Saul's trying to make this argument with him. Don't you know that David is a threat to you and your kingdom and you taking the throne? But Jonathan already, 1 Samuel 18, after David and Goliath, he takes off his royal robe and his armor and puts it on David, which is a sign that he has abdicated his right to the throne. And so he shows that Saul is still clinging to the idea that he has a kingdom, that he has a line, which Samuel's already told him. Your kingdom's already been torn from you. Just like you tore my robe, your kingdom's already been torn out of your hands. Saul should have stepped down at that time, but he kept going with the idea that he had a kingdom. At this point, David is going to have to flee. He's going to part with Jonathan. Unless I'm missing something key, they don't see each other again. They maintain their friendship, but they don't see each other again. And David's going to go into the wilderness, which is a key term in the Bible. Jesus goes into the wilderness. Israel goes into the wilderness. He's going to go into the wilderness and into exile, and he's going to be tested. And the next section of 1 Samuel deals with, is David really the right king? So we're going to see some of his successes and some of his failures and what those mean. Let's close in a word of prayer and take some of these truths with us as we go to worship. Lord God, just as we back into these things this morning, we thank you for this time we've had to just review how you work in your kingdom throughout history and how you use David and Jonathan as imperfect men, but more than that, Lord, how the definitions that your word sets up, and even the key failures of a great and godly man like David, show the need for Christ as the true king to restore the kingdom. And Lord, that we pray that you will help us to be future-oriented and looking to the return and the restoration of all things through Christ who is on the throne. So Lord, we pray that we will worship him as he deserves this morning as the head of the church. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.